went to school at Garfield High School, Gold Bulldogs, and during my time there, in just a few years, I've seen the community shift dramatically. I've seen a mini mart. I've seen our corner mini mart gas station turn into a multi-story apartment building with a new PCC at the bottom. And for those who don't know, PCC is like a local grocery store. And it's not until you start asking these questions of why is the community changing so fast? Why has a once historically Black community not have had access to local and healthy food until they're facing displacement come into this community, that you start to realize that Washington has a long history of racist policies. And it wasn't until recently that the idea of tax reform has crossed my mind. And it wasn't until being involved with All In for Washington that I realized that tax reform can be a really powerful tool in combating our state's history of racist policies. It can be a huge tool in creating economic justice. We're all making Washington our home, and our community is the heart of our home. But as Black and brown folks know very well, there are some people who don't want us to feel at home here. Through rules and policies and outright hate, they drive us out. And this is white supremacy in action. Sometimes it's obvious racism, other times it's more subtle, like our school budgets get cut, our neighborhoods aren't taken care of, our community needs are an afterthought. And you're all on this webinar today because you care about education and economic justice, and you know how deeply it affects your community, and you're willing to rise together in strength for a better world. In the wake of COVID-19, this pandemic has really hit our communities the hardest. This pandemic has just unveiled the racist rules and policies that has prevented our communities from thriving. But many of us are struggling, but you aren't struggling alone. In communities of color across the state, we're fighting for different versions of the same quest, justice for our communities, and a future where our families can not only recover from this pandemic, but truly thrive. And I'm here with you today to talk about building a statewide movement for economic justice led by people of color, because we know that our fights can't stand alone, and there's a lot we can learn from and share with each other. This graph shows that the median net worth of white households is 10 times that of Black households and more than 8 times that of Latinx households. Our economy has a huge impact on our lives. Right now, it only works for the rich and mostly the white. In 2018, the top 1% of owners owned almost half the wealth in our country. The wealth gap between white Americans and Black, Latinx, Native Americans, and many Asian Americans has grown dramatically since the 80s. If we want to make progress on any area of social and racial justice, we need to include economic justice, because what we make and what we have to do to make it, what the wealthy make and how they make it, and how our government raises revenue and spends it, all shapes our ability to live dignified, productive, and happy lives. And Washington's racial history has created this massive wealth gap between white households, Black households, Latinx households, and many households of color. Going back to slavery, Black people were bought and sold as property and provided free labor to build white people's capital. And then we have racial restrictive covenants where, depending on your race, you aren't able to live in certain neighborhoods. And then shifting into redlining when that wasn't allowed, it denied housing loans to, depending on your race, in certain neighborhoods. And then what we have today is gentrification, where once these communities of colors were forced to live, they're now being pushed out and aren't able to afford where they live. And here in Washington, we have the most upside down regressive tax code in the entire country. We are literally in last place. This working people pay up to 18% in state and local taxes, while the wealthiest just pay like 3%. Sorry, this graph is a little outdated, but on top of that, powerful special interests have manipulated our tax code with hundreds of wasteful tax breaks that drain revenue out of our budget and into their pockets. Our state relies too heavily on taxes that hit middle and low income workers are hit the hardest instead of taxing based on wealth. Poor people pay the same sales tax rate as rich people, but poor people have like much less to pay with it. Low income communities of color are the most deeply impacted. Not only are we paying a greater share of taxes, we don't see the benefit of those tax dollars in our communities. And the bottom line is that our tax code is racist, and it was designed like this for a reason. As you know, right now we're heading into a great recession with COVID-19. And next year, we're facing a $315 billion deficit in our budget. And already we see people are in the need for public assistance from the state. People need housing, people need healthcare services, people need mental health services, people need food programs. And on top of that, our most marginalized communities are excluded from federal benefits. Washington immigrants are wrongfully excluded from at least $700 million in state and federal cash assistance. That means they didn't receive stimulus payments, they don't receive enhanced unemployment benefits, they don't receive unemployment benefits either, they don't receive the stimulus benefits for each child. And what this looks like on the ground is we've talked with Julio Romero, a former president of Washington State Farmworkers Union. And he talked about the healthcare for farm workers in Wenatchee. And he shared that 82% of COVID cases affect Latinx and farm workers have limited access to face masks. And he shared that self-isolating in homes is nearly impossible. Like, could you imagine a 2-bedroom home housing 8 family members? It makes social distancing exceedingly difficult and allows the virus to spread so easily in the communities. And he shared that many workers who contract the virus are stuck at a crossroads between losing their wages by skipping out on work or just continually working through the sickness and risk. And the bottom line again, our essential workers are not disposable. And when we look at the state budget in schools, we see that students of color have a much greater impact from the statewide shortfall than white students. A 2019 report found that students in predominantly non-white school districts in Washington receive 18% less funding per student on average than students in white school districts, making Washington the 7th worst state in this measure of racial inequity. Despite Washington's progressive reputation, our state is 2nd worst in the country behind Arizona when it comes to inequitable funding for poor school districts, where the difference between non-white and white districts is 42% less funding per student. And what this disparity in funding looks like in the classroom, it looks like disparities in technology that supplement learning. It looks like differences in class offerings. It looks like non-white school districts having less college preparedness. And this is especially important moving into COVID area and transitioning back to schools. The physical spaces in classrooms are much smaller in underfunded schools, making social distancing exceedingly difficult for our students. And I'm just gonna play this video. It highlights the history of taxes in Washington and explains how we got here.
Washington State has a vibrant economy with booming tech, manufacturing, and agricultural sectors. People are moving here in droves for the plentiful jobs and quality of life. So why does the state have so much trouble raising enough tax revenue to pay for essentials like education, mental health care, and social services? Perhaps because Washington's tax system hasn't changed much since 1935. It's an antique. Most of the state's revenue comes from sales taxes paid by individuals and businesses. And because they're such an important revenue source, they keep going up. Now, Washington's sales taxes are some of the highest in the nation. But that tax base is shrinking. People are buying fewer taxable goods, and instead they spend more on services, which are not always taxed. And they buy online, where sales taxes aren't always collected. And for some of Washington's biggest industries, there are loopholes galore. High sales taxes hit poor folks harder than the rich. People who make less money pay a larger share of their earnings in taxes. Relying on the sales tax also means a bumpy time in economic downturns, because people stop spending and there aren't other sources to cushion the ride. Few states depend so much on sales taxes. Oregon doesn't have one at all. They rely largely on an income tax that goes up the more money you make. Idaho also has a graduated income tax, as well as a smaller sales tax. If either Oregon's or Idaho's tax systems were placed on Washington's economy, there would be more revenue, perhaps billions of dollars more per year. So why doesn't Washington trade in its sales tax for a hybrid, like a combination of reduced sales tax and a graduated income tax? That goes back to 1935, when Washington's Supreme Court ruled that the only kind of income tax allowable is a flat tax, where everyone pays the same percentage. That might sound more even and fair, but like the sales tax, a flat income tax is more burdensome on poor people. Because the less money you make, the more you need for life's necessities. So, until Washington's tax policy is fundamentally changed, balanced for a modern economy, the state will sputter along, hauling a heavier load with less and less power. In Close on KCTS 9 is made.
All right. Like the video said, Washington relies heavily on sales taxes, and Washington is number 4 in highest sales taxes in our country. And when we look at it, take a deeper look at that, we see the poorest 20% of communities of color are the highest tax group in our country, or in Washington. And the difference it takes in a year for a person to pay their taxes is people who make over $507,000, it takes them 9 days to pay their taxes. And people who make less than $21,000 a year, it takes them 2 months to generate enough money to pay their taxes. And over the last decade, we've seen state spending go down in our budget on critical programs as education, healthcare, mental health services, economic security. And with COVID-19, we can only expect this cut to be more severe if we don't act now. COVID-19 has caused a collapse of economic activity, and this collapse means a collapse in state revenue from sales and business taxes. So the people of Washington, we face really a simple choice. We can either cut spending, which will hurt people in need and depress economic activity as the flow of money in Washington communities dries up even further, or we can take the more equitable and common sense approach is by raising taxes on those on top, which will preserve needed spending, help people in need, keep state workers employed, and ensure that money continues to circulate in Washington communities, increasing economic activity. And if you're wondering what our state budget looks like, this is how it plays into our daily lives. These are the things that keep our community safe. These are programs that are needed for a just recovery from COVID-19. And these are a lot of the same calls that defunding the police calls for and calls for community safety. And we can't afford to have these programs cut even further. And it doesn't really have to be that way. We have immense wealth in our state. And by tapping into the concentrated wealth to fix our systemic racism in our tax code, we can generate a lot of money. Just looking at financial assets and real estate alone, we can generate a lot of money to balance our tax codes. 1.5 trillion is the amount of money we have in the total market value of all real estate in the state. 1.5 trillion is an unfathomably large amount of money. And when we take a deeper look into it, a lot of people own real estate, but when we see where real estate is most heavily concentrated, it's concentrated amongst the wealthiest 10%. And when we put a racial lens on that, we see that the history of Washington's racial policies has created a huge real estate disparity in ownership between white households and Black and African American households. And even as the real estate ownership is a huge disparity, we see that the lowest 20% are paying the highest amount of their taxes in property taxes. And our property tax code is largely upside down, when it should look like this, a right side up property tax code where the top 1% pay a little bit more, so the struggling lowest 20% can pay less. The red is what our tax code looks like. And when we add in progressive revenue from capital gains and or working families tax rebate, which I will go into later, we can see real equitable change where the lowest 20% pay lower in taxes and the top 1% just pay a little bit more. So moving into 2021, our goal is to significantly rebalance the tax code, and it's also to create a just recovery from COVID-19 that keeps racial equity and economic justice on our minds. And these are some of our policy proposals. I'll go into capital gains and working families tax credit on the next slide, but we're also pushing for an excessive wage tax, pass-through business profits, mansions and high real estate, large estates and inheritances, and strengthen our rainy day fund. A capital gains tax is basically a tax on a non-inventory asset, and a non-inventory asset is like stocks, bonds, precious metals, real estate, and property. And we have 14 billionaires in our state and the first projected trillionaire. The wealthiest 10% has even profited off COVID-19 and will continue to pocket money, while communities of color take the economic hits. However, imposing a capital gains tax could greatly reduce financial burdens on families. Tapping into this wealth and enhancing a working families tax credit, which will put cash back into the pockets of working families, will reduce the cost of taxes that cut into families' budgets. This cash assistance will cover those who have been wrongfully excluded from federal assistance, such as ITIN filers and unpaid caregivers. And with soaring levels of food insecurity and the fear of impending evictions, our most marginalized communities need cash assistance now more than ever. And this shows that the working family tax rebate can be a really powerful tool in creating economic justice, as many communities of color would greatly benefit from this rebate. In Washington State, we have immense wealth, we have the tools, and it's time to align our progressive reputation with our policies. And from here, I'll pass it on to Boca, the director of All In for Washington, to talk a little bit more about his work and his vision.
Thank you, Bennet. Hi, folks. My name is Juan Bocanegra. You know, the information that Bennet just shared with you is probably one of the easiest way to describe to everybody what is happening to our communities in the state of Washington. I've been here since 1971. And every year that I've been here, we have been trying to change the tax code of the state of Washington. At least that's what we've tried. But unfortunately, the rich in this state are still very powerful. We have been for years trying to break down the doors to allow us to come in. And we now have representatives in our state government who are people of color, who are, you know, supposed to be there to defend our interests. And I believe that, you know, that their intent and their concerns are sincere. The problem is that we're working in a bubble that has turned this state into the Bahamas of the Americas. And one of the reasons that a lot of the companies have flourished here is because they haven't had to pay taxes, and they have benefited out of changing the tax burden over to the working class of this state. And in the city of Seattle, fortunately, we have had a real great resounding voice of trying to change the burden over from the poor to the rich, of paying for the benefits that the rich get, which are the public safety, the streets, the plumbing, the buildings, all the things that we provide for the rich. I mean, this is not like we're asking them, you know, to give us you know, any type of charity. This is not charity. This is money that they owe us over centuries of exploitation. And so, you know, one of the concerns that I have, and I will share with you, is that we have two parties in the state that relatively pass the ball to each other, from the Republican to the Democratic Party. And while we tend to think of the Democratic Party as progressive, we know that in this state, they have been part of the problem in terms of keeping our communities oppressed. And we've been lucky enough in the city of Seattle to have people like Shama Sawant, who have exposed the problem of the rich and their debt to our society or the rest of the community. Unfortunately, we don't have a Shama in Olympia. And as much as some of the more progressive elements criticize Shama within our state, and also the right wing criticize Shama, she has been at the forefront of that struggle in trying to leverage the resources that our communities need to survive. Not only survive, but thrive, because that's the most important part. We've been surviving over generations, and we have made this state rich. We deserve to have our lives change for the future. And, you know, I leave you with this thought, and that is that we're only going to accomplish this if we get organized, and if we retain and regain our voice and start to talk to other people in our communities about refocusing our attention, not on the needs, because we all know what the needs are, but on the response and the urgency of the rich putting in the money that we need for this state to make it through the depression, not the recession, but the depression that we're going to go into. And I think one of the problems that we have at this particular juncture is that our communities of color have not participated in the tax discussion. We have not participated in the budget discussion, just since only recently. And we've got to get back and put the backbone into our representatives and push them and tell them that we need some resolution to the problems that Bennet has just outlined, which are simple. This doesn't take a, you know, an Oreo cookie scientist to figure this shit out, right? I mean, we have definitely had quite a bit of years of history pointing this out, and it became evident through this virus that capitalism, as it stands now, is destroying our lives. And the rich will continue to destroy our lives if we let them. And we, you know, at this point, it's a juncture of survival for us. It's not just a question of, you know, question of justice or a question of, you know, the credibility that we as people know and our dignity. We're talking about survival. Because by the middle of December, if we haven't hit, you know, 300,000 people dead in this state, that's going to be a miracle. We have to put our shoulders to the wheel, and I may not be there with you, but we got to put our shoulders to the wheel and push together, people, Black people, Native people, Latinos, Asians, and white working people. We have all got to come together and impress upon the state leadership that the state structure needs to change for the benefit of everybody. You know, I really appreciate you guys helping us out on this. You know, there's nothing that we can provide you to continue the struggle except your understanding and your knowledge and your experience in seeing this great injustices through. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over back to Bennet.
Thanks, Boca. Next, I'm going to invite one of our student organizers, Chardonnay Beaver, to talk about her experiences so far with Allen for Washington, and also as a college student.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chardonnay Beaver, and I am a student organizer. First and foremost, thank you, Boca and Bennet. You guys did an incredible job of outlining just the basis of economic injustice in Washington. And I am a rising sophomore at the University of Washington, Seattle, and I'm currently a student organizer with All In for Washington. I'm also majoring in political science, so these conversations and these dialogues are so imperative because they overlap with politics, but they also overlap with our survival and perseverance as Black and Brown people in Washington, specifically in King County. So really quick, to just kind of give an overview of the vision of this and how this relates to where I come from and why this is relevant to me is because I'm from the Central District of Seattle, and I'm fifth generation Seattleite here in Washington. And King County, the actual name King, derives from Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr., aside from his effortless, well, there was a lot of effort actually, but it seemed so effortless because he was resilient in it, his work with desegregation, but his dedication with economic injustice, especially when turning over the years from the 50s to the 1960s prior to his death. He was doing a lot of work with economic justice. And we hope today to echo his work as discussing the legacy of economic justice in education. And I want to point out why this panel and the conversations around tax reform is relevant and think about. And so a few things. First and foremost, before we get into the panel, we know that tax money and taxes, income taxes, comes from the people's work. This is the people's money in which we are paying for taxes so that these monies and these funds go towards different state revenues. If our money is being put into putting our kids in cages, that doesn't make sense. So talk about education, but we also talk about the shortfall of the prison pipeline. We also talk about the lack of resources and gentrification as well, how that relates to it. Bennet did a great job discussing the history of gentrification and redlining the Seattle area. And so there's so many intersections, and I want to highlight those major points because it all connects to this November, which is voting. And Boca brought up a great point about having people of color, people who look like us in those seats. So please vote. I have my Yes We Can shirt on today. Please vote this November 3rd, 2020. But so to begin our panel, I'm going to introduce some incredible folks who have been just in the community, but also I want to thank them for dedicating their time to this panel today. First, we have Jesse Hagopian. He is an educator, author of Teaching Black Lives. If you haven't read the book, I totally recommend it. And an activist. We have Manus, which is representing the Urban League Metropolitan Seattle. Ileyana Taylor, who is a student, college student, and an All In for Washington student organizer. And we also have Emijah Smith, a parent, education advocate, and community organizer. And so to begin our panel, I'm going to share this screen with you all so that you can see our questions. Thank you for your patience with me. And I'm going to move this to present. Okay, awesome. Gonna move this over and shrink that up. Okay, so for our questions, we have question 1. Okay. So first and foremost, Mr. Hagopian, what is your role in the community and how are you able to share your passion about education and equity with others?
Thank you, Chardonnay. It's so good to have gone from you being in my ethnic studies class to seeing you leading movements for economic and racial justice. It warms my heart. And I also just want to say, I think Bennet should probably be our next state representative. Thank you for breaking all that history and economic analysis down. So I teach at Garfield High School, and I am an organizer with Black Lives Matter at school and supporting the work of King County Equity Now and Decriminalize Seattle. And it's an honor to be on this panel with everybody. Worked a long time with Juan Bocanegra and Emijah. So we've all been in this struggle to try to link the struggle for racial justice with economic justice, because I think that has always been the struggle that Black and Indigenous and people of color have had to do. And one of the ways I've done that is to fight for school funding in this state. And I'll just tell a quick story that in 2011, not long after the Great Recession, they were getting ready to cut yet again from the school budget. And Occupy protesters went down to the state capitol, and I helped organize a delegation of educators with the social equity educators. And we went down to the House Ways and Means Committee meeting where they were getting ready to cut the budget from our schools. And we thought we needed to teach them a lesson as educators, because the state constitution says that it's the paramount duty of the state to fully fund education. So we went into the meeting where they were getting ready to cut the budget, and I stood up and mic checked the room and read out the state constitution with all the educators repeating it. And we interrupted their meeting to let them know that this was the scene of a crime, that they were getting ready to violate the state constitution. And I even brought with me a pair of plastic handcuffs and invited them to come into my custody with the citizen's arrest. And the officer in the room didn't agree with my interpretation of the law, and the police officer arrested me and took me to jail for the evening. And you know, my students found out about that, and the next day they organized a walkout of Garfield to fully fund education and went down to the mayor's office and even got their picture in the New York Times. And so I think that the key to this is organizing in your base, in your community, and doing collective organizing that links the struggle for racial justice with the struggle for economic justice.
Right. This, and I know that, okay, that is awesome. And I know that the work of an organizer, but also just someone who's really dedicated in this work and trying to be a change maker isn't easy. And it comes with a lot of sacrifices, even your freedom. But I think that's awesome that that's a shared thing that we have here with our panelists, with just being passionate about the work in their community. And so my next question that I also want to piggyback on that question with other panelists. Emijah and Maya and Ileyana, can you guys share your roles in the communities for those who may not be familiar?
I'll jump in. Hi, my name is Emijah, and I would consider my role as a community queen, just being a parent, a mother, a grandmother, someone who's involved in community. I definitely center my values around relationships. So if you see me in community, I care about how you're doing. I want to get to know you, like try to make a connection. I'm not a major social butterfly, but that's where my intentions and my heart is. And so a lot of my, I consider myself an organizer, but not so much a community organizer, because I think the way that I build relationships in community is a little more natural. It's not always issue-based. It's really at the end of the day, how are you doing? How are we doing? And how are the children, right? Because that's to make sure the community is well. So I've myself, who's from Seattle, a native here, attended Garfield. I'm definitely a Bulldog alumni.
Yes.
Grew up in the CD and really watched the beginnings of the gentrification as I knew it. When they started bringing drugs into the community, gangs, and the policy that they were trying to push around who's quote unquote a gang member. You know, you didn't have to be in a gang, but if you just hung around your family members in a certain area, they put you in the database and say you were a gang member. And watch my peers, you know, be incarcerated and be trapped into those systems. So those policies of the 80s and the 90s, where I have friends that I grew up with who are still, you know, who are struck out and, or who have time that's like 60 years, just de facto life is what they call it.
Yeah.
Just watching, like when you get into that system, it's really hard to get out. It's not like, oh, just go to court. You have to know that system. And you think about, I think about my community at the time, and for me, it definitely was working class and a lot of professionals who, you know, from the Black community, a lot of love and support, in my opinion. You know, the Black Panthers from the central area, just, I know some of those elders right now. I knew them as children, and I know those now who are able to still be with us, hang out with them, talk to them firsthand. The organizing in the churches, mothers of the churches, just people in the churches talking about issues and caring about issues. So I consider myself similar to those people, and then, or to that model leadership. And so my style of being in the community and why I have these passions is because they were modeled for me, and I was able to see and actually live through the experience of that crack and that poison brought into our community. I was there watching that experience of families being separated, no services, being criminalized for being a victim of addiction. So when you see these things from your peers to family members, other community members, you're watching the rationale of why they're taking people's property. You're hearing what's in the media. I mean, before I knew of somebody coming really snatching property, I would hear how bad the community was. And I was like, that's not how I feel. I didn't feel unsafe walking outside of my home. I just didn't. But I also there's a lot of, because there was so much support. Two blocks down the road, somebody's grandma's gonna see me and tell my grandma what's going on. So it was just those things where I felt like I had a safety net. And my grandparents' home was like a safety net for folks who needed food, needed shelter. So if they have that, I have that. So the way that my community was depicted, I just didn't have that shared reality. So I'm one of trying to be a keeper of community and keeper of values and keeper of culture that I was privileged to have, and move that forward, and also speak truth to power, and to speak about the injustices and really not being afraid to do so. If that makes me a community organizer, then so be it. But I think it's just what we all should be doing. We all should be charged with this, because we should be outraged of what's happening in our community and what's historically happened to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and people of color. We should not be watching this and being so afraid of whatever we're afraid of, and not say something or do something. At the least, go shore that person up and say, ask them if they're okay.
Right. Yes.
I can add my role in the community real quick. So currently I analyze policy, try to get people out to register to vote and complete the census. So I'm involved in, just advocacy and civic engagement work. I think the role that I have to the community is to be able to do policy analysis and research and be able to synthesize that and make it accessible for the community, and being able to understand that, because going to Olympia or understanding how a bill gets passed or what a policy even is, it can be really complex. And so I really try to understand that system and make sure it's understanding for others. And so currently right now, the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle is really trying to focus on first-time voters and giving them the knowledge and information to be able to understand what's on their ballot, what they need to know in terms of deadlines and everything like that. And then also I am currently a law student at Seattle University. And so being able to starting to learn and hone in on my skills on not only policy, but how to look at it more on a legal realm has been very helpful in terms of having that understanding and being able to connect it with community, and understanding that issues can connect to policy, and something as simple as the tax structure can be changed and be more equitable off of policy, and being able to make that connection and have our community charged up about it just as much as Emijah was saying. It's kind of weird to not be charged up about it, especially when you can see the connections within your own life.
Yes, Ileyana, would you like to tell your role?
Yes, of course. I'm Ileyana. I would say my role in the community is just being like a student leader, just also being a part of the All-In for Washington, but definitely being a student, and everywhere I go, like from school, like I went to Garfield also, and now I'm going on to college, and just trying to, where I go, trying to educate my peers and friends about things that are definitely important to all of us, but isn't like the light isn't shined on it as such. So I definitely use, talking to my friends and peers and classmates as a time to share my passion of sharing like the injustices. I also am going to school to become a teacher because I want to be able to be, one, the representation for the students, but also to share with students that, hey, like there's such things going on. Here's the facts behind it, and definitely they need to know about it because, one, it's going to further their family's understanding about it, because students love to go home and be like, hey mom, hey dad, I learned about this today. And that's also a learning moment for the parents and the grandparents and the guardians. So yeah, I definitely love to share my passion of like injustices, and especially like taxes and stuff that can be changed.
Right, that's so awesome. I think that's something that I'm taking from all of your stories, because I consider myself a storyteller, and what I'm taking from all of your stories is that your role in the community, you being you, makes the community what it is, like your worldview of it, and also your representation, whether that be in the classroom, whether that be in the community, whether that be in Seattle doing Urban League and in law school right now. Like, it's being prolific and doing things in many ways. I know you can't see it on my wall. I have Nipsey Hussle up there for one reason of being prolific and using those things and championing on who we are naturally, which is resilient. So to that point, I'm going to bounce around a little bit of questions. But what are the biggest concerns as COVID-19 carries on? How have you witnessed COVID-19 affect the finances of family of color in Seattle? So we know that there's a history behind, like Emijah, you did a beautiful job describing just the formation of inequity and of, I mean, it's been happening for a long time, but injustice in the Seattle area, and you living it. Now we're in this new wave with the whole global pandemic, but also a racial pandemic. And how are we seeing that affecting the finances of people of color, Black people? Maya, do you want to start this one off?
Oh, I thought you were directing it to Emijah, but I think there's multiple things, right, that I think that as COVID-19 carries on that we should have to worry about. Small businesses are closing. The educational gap is just going to be wider as school is online. And that's due to the fact that not all families have access to internet. There is a digital divide, or have access to quality broadband where they might have multiple kids. And so there could be, patchy services. There's going to be an educational gap. There's going to be a recovery for small business owners, those who were in promising careers, such as the hospitality business arena or others, that are going to need to look at a way to possibly recover and get through this. And so that is one of the reasons why it is really important for you to vote this year, is not only to focus on what's happening nationally, but what's going to happen to Washington in the next 1 to 2 years is going to be vital on who we select locally to go to Olympia, to figure out what to do with the budget shortfall. What do we do with undocumented Washington families and then not having relief, economic relief on a federal level? What do we do that families, are not able to provide nutritious food for their children? So all of this, what I think COVID-19 has showed is the injustices that happened prior. I believe that we were going through all of this beforehand. COVID-19 just made everybody stop for a second and show that there is injustices in a lot of these places. And so I think that's one of the things as COVID-19 continues on, that we're going to continue to see and highlight and showcase.
Yeah, Ileyana, would you like to piggyback off of this one as a student? Like, what are some of your concerns with COVID? I know that you were wrapping up your senior year when everything kind of took off. Do you have any points on that financially?
Definitely. I was, as a senior, I was definitely like battling, like, being angry at the fact that I couldn't, do the senior things, but also being angry at the amount of deaths and the lack of control I felt, and that some of my peers that I talked to felt about the situation, how we felt like we didn't have any control over it, and watching how the politicians were handling this was infuriating. But like, definitely financing of just one stimulus check of, like, my mom's a teacher, and if we hadn't saved up money for a few months, definitely we would have to try to figure out what to do when it came to rent, just because one stimulus check is not going to cut it, especially when we all live in a place that has high rent and a high cost of living. So like $1,200 is barely cuts like a lot of people's rent, or even getting groceries on their table. So that was a thing that was definitely like financially awakening, of just like, oh, like we'd be in deep trouble if we hadn't saved up. And I know a lot of families that definitely don't have that resource of saving up, so it's harder for them, and it definitely hit them harder. I've had multiple neighbors move out of the apartment complex just because they couldn't pay anymore. So yeah.
No, that's so real. And I love that you really touched on that, because not only as a student, you are juggling these things, you're speaking from a perspective of like everything being magnified. And I definitely felt that. I don't know about attendees, but to a point, like as a college student going to U, I had this great professor, Professor Bonus, and he was an American Ethnic Studies teacher, and he discussed some intersections between economic injustice and racial justice. And I kind of go a little bit deeper into education, because we know that, again, to highlight the work of Dr. King, he was so focused on segregation, boycotting, just racial justice. And say the civil rights movement, you have people, the 50s and late 50s, like wanting to get and rally around youth being represented in proper education. But you also, at the same token, have a realization into the 60s, later 60s and 70s, that there's some economic justice that we need, because specifically Black people have been economically disenfranchised for years. And we know that Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities are building the economy of this country. Immigrants are building the economy of this country. And so when it comes into the conversation of who is having assistance, we should be considering the people who have worked and created the assistance to begin with. And so when it comes down, that's my mini rant. When it comes down to education, why is it important that economic literacy is taught inside and outside of the school? Because Ileyana made that point, like she's aware, hey, if we don't have X amount of money, we can't cover this amount of rent. And when you think about taxes, if you're paying most of your money, let's say 3 months of your rent goes into your taxes, how are you going to make it in times of COVID when you're not working for 3 months? Emijah, would you like to touch on this one? why is it important that economic literacy is taught inside and outside the school?
Thank you for sharing that, or asking me. I'm gonna come from a parent perspective, but also what my grandfather was modeling for me. You know, he worked, he had a small business on the side, and he really instilled in my mother and her siblings about figuring out a way to get your own business and have your own hustle. And I don't want to say hustle in a really bad term, because people take it wrong. Maybe not us in this space, but people do. But you know how to figure it out. So I have an uncle who started his own business washing windows. It's like, you just have to be innovative and creative and figure out how to bring some money and put food on the table for your family. So I just want to say that first and foremost. And I think that comes from a place of, you know, historically in this country, no one's getting any privileges off the side to figure out in their survival, other than privileged folks who these institutions were meant to support. And unfortunately, white folks and rich folks to continue that cycle. So anyhow, I believe that financial literacy is very vital and very important, because we live in a society that's based in classism. I mean, capitalism, I apologize, but classism is an issue, but capitalism. So you should understand, what does that mean? And taxes is a very integral part of capitalism, and figuring out how we sustain ourselves in the US economy. So we should be teaching our children this early on, whether you agree with how the system is set up or not. You should be aware of how the system is set up and how your survival is incorporated in that. BIPOC communities have been navigating around that system, been oppressed by that system for, you know, centuries, of course. But I think as early as in elementary school, we should be understanding what money is like, because we understand money. We understand we want to go to the store and buy something, what that means. We understand we got to get this money to pay this rent. So just as important it is, I mean, counting to me should be connected to your money. Your multiplication needs to be connected to the economy. In financial literacy, and definitely in middle school, we should be considering how, you know, checks and credit cards, you should be engaged around the concept. And as early as possible, definitely figuring out how to start your own business, how do you be part of the economy, and what's your role in that? So I'm always talking to my children about opportunities. You want some extra money? There's lots of cars out here. You might want to go ask the neighbors, can you wash their car? Can you pick up their leaves? Just to give them a sense of, what does this really mean? Not my mom, why does this food keep popping up? Or why is it not popping up? How come we don't have salmon this month? You know, we're eating something different. So, and salmon's a very staple food in my household, but it's also expensive, even farm raised salmon, which isn't as healthy. But my children know the difference when we have a staple in the home and when we don't have a staple in the home. I think it's very vital, and particularly for marginalized communities, we need to know. And I'm feeling like COVID, you know, growing up not totally understanding about microeconomies and learning about them, being on outside of the US boundaries and other countries and continents, and how our country wants to go over and help people with their microeconomies and help people figure out what they can sell to make money. And I think that needs to be happening right now with our youngest, because they are depending on us for the understanding, like Mr. Boca said, but they're also looking for us to model for them how to sustain. And I am relying on them to figure it out so that we could be creative and not just, you know, we're falling off while the rich keep, the few percent, that 1% is owning everything, and you're just under a level of control you don't even, your mind can't even fathom.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. That there's so many layers to that, and I think that I remember having my first job and getting my first check and thinking, where did all my money go? And my mom was like, you got to pay taxes. You know, you have your Social Security. I'm like, but my money. And you think about that because you know that this is supposed to last you a certain amount of time. So you, like, that was mind-blowing for me when I got my first check. It was hilarious. But I love the salmon. I'm a pescatarian, so yes, salmon. Um, yeah, and just open. Question that I have for you all is about how have you seen, so in schools, right, and in the community, whether that be through policy work or through actually being a teacher, and we know that Hagopian, you have done work around ethnic studies and fighting for that to be in schools. Huge advocate for ethnic studies. Now, why is it important that students have economic empowerment, but that communities have economic empowerment as well? Whether that be understanding how that relates to voting and why we need to vote in the sense of our pocket, but also how we need to have that in the schools, the same fight that we've been having around equity and ethnic studies. So.
Well, I could start. Thank you for that question. I think it's so important that we really dig into how to create economic empowerment for those who have been systematically oppressed since the beginning of this country. And, you know, part of my advocacy for ethnic studies is to deepen the conversation about and center really Black leadership throughout history. And so often all we ever talk about is Martin Luther King, but I also want to stress that we never actually learn the real Martin Luther King in school as well, because the real Martin Luther King is far too radical for this system to be educating the youth about. If we actually learned about his commitment to economic justice, then we would have a different society already. So I want to read you all a quote from Martin Luther King when he said, "You can't talk about solving the economic problem of Black people without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of the slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground then, because you are messing with folks then. You are messing with the captains of industry. Now, this means that we are treading in difficult water, because it really means that we are saying that there is something wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism," right? And that kind of a quote about wanting to overturn the economic order and implement democratic socialism has to be hidden from youth if our society is going to maintain this kind of inequality and institutional racism. So I think part of the fight for ethnic studies is about bringing in the real legacy of many of the Black leaders throughout history who have always known that there is no Black liberation without economic freedom as well, and without being put in towards the center of the economic system. Because and I'll just end by saying that I think that the way that the richest 1% continue to maintain their wealth is by a divide and conquer strategy, right? And this is how it's functioned since the beginning, since Bacon's Rebellion in the mid 1600s. And we have to be clear that economic inequality and institutional racism don't operate on separate tracks. They really reinforce each other. So the way they divide us is they project racism through the corporate media and the politicians. So we hear Trump trying to blame undocumented immigrants for the economy, right? And get everyone to blame Latinx folks and immigrants for our problems, right? And then you have the corporate media trying to blame Black people for criminality and poverty. You have, you know, we just had the 9/11 anniversary, and so you hear all of this racist attacks on Muslims, right? Trying to blame all Muslim people for 9/11. And it's these sort of racist attacks that they try to convince us that those with the least power in society are the ones that are causing the problems, in order to deflect from the fact that, you know, the 8 richest people in the country today have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet. That's an obscenity. And if we don't solve that issue, there is no justice for anybody. So I think that's really what we're called upon to do, is overcome the divisions between communities, link arms, and go get that money from the 1%.
Can I just confirm, when you said that the top 8, are 2 of those in Washington, in King County, that I
Yeah.
understand?
Absolutely. Bill Gates and Bezos, who's projected to be the first trillionaire in world history. I mean, this is, while we got 150 homeless kids at Garfield High School, I mean, this is the kind of obscene hoarding of wealth that's destroying our society. And finally, there's a rebellion kicking off that's looking at where the wealth is being invested. And, you know, that's our job, is to connect those struggles together.
Right. Maya, would you like to do that?
Yeah, I think, I think overall the education system has been failing our youth, or, new generation with anything. Because if you think about it as well, with the lack of ethnic studies, the lack of economic education, there's also have been a huge lack in civic education as well. So with that, they could see that, the central district is changing, or can see that their schools aren't getting food in the first month. When they're in school, they see all these things, but they don't see the connection in terms of how it can relate to, the Office of Public Instruction, or the governor, or the lieutenant governor, and so, but they all have a huge part in how schools are ran, how their communities, even completing the census, they don't learn about that. And so I think overall there is a lack of education in how someone themselves, how what's around them, how it's affecting them, and how they can change it, whether that be how do they properly fill out their taxes, whether that be how do they talk to their legislature, whether that be knowing that there's been Black scientists before. All of that, I think, has had an effect on why we're currently in this situation right now. And I think, if we, this isn't a perfect system, and it's derived off of supporting white male business owners. But I think with learning the tools of the system, we can be able to change it where it can benefit us, and be able to highlight, what Martin Luther King Jr. said, and what everybody else has been saying today in terms of really fighting for, economic justice. Because there's some jurisdictions and areas that have a childhood savings account. And just because a child is born in a certain area, they get a savings account that accrues interest each year to be able to pay for going to school, or going to a trade school, or starting their own business. So I think we can all, if we really put our minds together and lockstep together, we can be able to make some really progressive, mind-blowing, innovative policy to be able to help us recover.
Wow. The intelligence and experience and insight on this panel is mind-blowing. Like you said, Boca, earlier, these are conversations that people who look like us need to know, people who look like us need to be involved in. And so that's the work that the student organizers, myself, Bennet and Ileyana are working on doing, especially in King County. But I have one last question to wrap up our panel, and I would love to hear from each and every panelist. And the last question that I will be asking today is, what would reinvestment in your community look like? So reinvestment, not just the work that you're doing, but illustrate that for me. Give me a picture of what that would look like for you, to put us in the right direction. Let's see, who should we start off with? Let's start off with our community queen. I love that term too. Emijah.
Well, I would love to invite you to one of my Community Queen Collective conversations. I'll send you a, yes. Thank you. What it will look like. I need a little bit more time to process, but I'll just tell you what's coming off the top of my head. First and foremost, and top priority is investing in you all. I'm really impressed by the youth on the panel and organizing this. Thank you, Chardonnay, for the invitation. It really does like give me life and more power to work harder. So thank you all. Well, we're here to talk about, you know, taxes. So I think an investment really is to really make sure every adult and youth person is sending them information down around financial literacy and the importance of taxes, start making it palatable for young people. And when I say young people, I'm talking about like at least eight-year-olds, making it palatable. I want to say invest in the community education, invest in the community work that's outside of these major institutions, but invest in the understanding of how to be anti-racist, understanding what institutional racism looks like, and really understanding what meaningful solidarity work looks like. What does that mean? If we talk about a policy, the investment needs to make sure that the policy actually makes sense and touches back to the community who was most impacted. If we're going to talk about financial literacy, it must touch base to go back and make an impact and change something with the communities who are most impacted. I don't see the point of talking about it for the sake of talking about it. I don't see the point of trying to be an expert about a system that does not work, that is founded in white supremacy, and that we keep trying to perpetuate that wheel. We have to be fighting it. So the investment to me is to make financial contributions to the community who are most marginalized and oppressed. That is Black, Indigenous, and Latinx. And I am known for always speaking and prioritizing my community because that is my job, and I would not expect less of anybody else outside of my community. But it has to, and within my community, I'm going to give the charge to the Black community. We need to invest in those who are most impacted by any policy. And we must also ourselves within the Black community, and I put this charge to their other communities to talk about it. We must be equitable about how we spend our resources. Do not invest in solidarity work and invest in the healing so that we are not having the generations coming behind us making the same mistakes and tripping over things that they don't need to be tripping over their feet about. We need to move out the way. So whatever that investment looks like, but to me, go talk to the community who's most impacted, ask them what they need and invest in it. Thanks.
Yes. Ileyana, would you like to answer this one as well? Oh, Sue.
Of course. Yes. Reinvestment, community. When I hear that question, I just think of community centers and like programs that will benefit the youth, but definitely also giving back to the minority groups and creating programs, especially for those that were incarcerated and like wrongfully incarcerated, but also helping them get back on their feet. So programs like that, and programs that also help, people eat, because I know that the community struggles with poverty, and the homeless population is steadily increasing. So programs like that, if that would, our community would be reinvested in, yes.
Okay, we have one call to action afterwards. So Mr. Hagopian and Maya, would you guys like to conclude?
Oh, okay. Well, I think this great discussion has kicked off because of the rebellion for Black Lives in the streets about what our budgetary priorities are. And, amazing organizing efforts from King County Equity Now and Decriminalize Seattle have totally transformed the political landscape and the discussion about where our tax money should be spent. And the call to defund the police and reinvest it into community services, I think has made great strides to transforming consciousness in our city and across this country around the totally upside down priorities of a system where the police are the largest portion of the budget in the city, right? And so we've seen, the Seattle police budget is over $400 million. Meanwhile, we don't have restorative justice counselors in our schools, right? And so, they build a new $200 million youth jail to lock kids away and, throw away their future, but they can't find the money to lower class size, to bring trauma counselors to our schools. We in Seattle, with two of the richest people who have ever lived in the history of humanity, we don't have a nurse in every school building, even in this time of a global pandemic, right? That is an obscenity that we have to be able to call out and say, we know the services that would be able to provide all of our youth with a bright future so they would never end up in the jail in the first place. But our system is too bent on profit instead of the needs of people. And so that's the struggle that we're in today.
Thank you so much. Maya, would you like to conclude this one before our call to action?
Sure. I think what reinvestment in community means to me would mean that no one would have to have the thought of sleeping in their car. No one would have to go a day without eating. If they've fallen under addiction, they're not criminalized by it. Where my tax dollars are not going to Black and brown bodies being murdered. So I think reinvestment in community means all of that and so much more, where the richest people in the world don't feel like it is an opportunity to thrive here because they know of all the tax breaks that we have here in Washington State. It is on purpose that Amazon and Microsoft and Boeing are here. It's on purpose that Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos is here. It is on purpose why Central District doesn't look the same that it does, that Hilltop, I'm a Tacoma native, so why Hilltop doesn't look the same that it does. And so I think in reinvestment in community for me is to have our tax dollars come back to us and actually see them work to help us thrive, not to, murder us, make us go hungry and so much more. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time and participation. I also want to thank our attendees. Before I send it off to Bennet, I just want to say, make sure to vote. Like you said, Maya, this is not on purpose. My great-great-grandfather came up here to work the railroads, to work with Bowen. So thank you so much. And we want to see communities of color thrive, not just survive, in the words of Boca. Okay. Bennet, would you like to close with the calls of action?
Of course. Here we go. Oops. There we go. While it's loading, yeah, just to echo Chardonnay, I would like to thank our lovely panelists again for taking the time to share with us their passion and work in their communities. Thank you for facilitating, Shar. Thanks, Boca, for joining in as well. And before we leave here, we want to leave you with some calls to action. So the census is coming up. It's really important that we all fill that out. It's how the state appropriates funding. Like Shar said, remember to register to vote. It's the most effective way we can bring change in our local communities. And like Maya was saying, we need our tax dollars back into our communities. We need to call our legislatures and to say no more cuts, no more austerity cuts, no more harmful cuts in our community, and we need progressive revenues from the policy proposals we've talked about earlier. And we need cash in our pockets. We need a recovery rebate and a working families tax credit. We invite you all to join in All In for Washington in our campaign. I've left my email here. I've also left Boca's email. Feel free to contact us if you want to get involved. We'll also be distributing this webinar out. We have it recorded. And yes, I just want to thank you all again for taking time out of your Sunday. And Chardonnay has pointed out we have an Instagram account. It's called All In for WA. I'll drop it in the chat. You can follow us there. And yes, thank you again for this lovely conversation. It doesn't end here. We have more work to do, but we're just starting the conversation today. So thank you all.
Right on. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
Can our
afternoon.
panelists stay on? Can our panelists stay on for just another minute?
Gracias.
Thank you, attendees. I just want to make sure that we have all yours emailed because we have something that we would like to gift you for your role in this. We just want to make sure that your work is valued and doesn't go unpaid or unappreciated. So we'll be emailing you something over, and thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Y'all did a great job. Let me know if there's any way I can support this because it's just some of the most important work we could be doing. So let me know.
Right
Great.
on.
We will.
Yes,
So much.
I just definitely want to support you all. So text, email me, just let me know. Thanks.
Yeah, especially around voting or anything, let me know.
Yes, let's stay connected.
All
Ileyana,
right.
you were a great panelist.
No doubt. Good to hear you're doing well, Ileyana.
That was
And,
amazing.
Sorry, I have to run out to another meeting on a Sunday.
yeah. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye. Ileyana.